This seems to be working. So, and I also share my screen to start off, and we'll start with my bad handwriting. This is my experiment with having a live board in a way, like this is a Affinity photo, so I can draw on this live, but it also contains my slides, so to speak. So, but to start with the kind of introduction, I mean, this is introduction to XORG Lego blocks, but introduction to the whole session. First of all, the goal of this session, at least from my side, you can have your own sub goals, is populating a map, and it's an A map, in a way of a map of tools of approaching organization from the game side. Of course, it's an A map because it's not the only way to approach organizations, and it should not be. I don't think there's really point of trying to aim for only one approach towards this. And by the populating, I mean, like, this is giving like an overview, a bird's eye view of like, oh, there's these areas and these areas, there's these kind of instruments and that kind of instruments, or that kind of concepts, etc. That can be considered, and then underneath them there are approaches like, oh, okay, like if there is that concept, it has these and these tendencies of behavior. So that's the general goal of this session, that hopefully can come up with some kind of map on some kind of sense of what can come from games towards organizations. It's not going to be an exhaustive map in any way because it's an introduction session, and that's why the introduction is on the title. Secondly, as an intro on the nature of these Lego blocks, I'll go to the Lego blocks in a couple of ways when we come to exact cases, but just as a general point, that these Lego blocks are by nature something that are moldable. They are not, once again, exhaustive, any one of them either, but this is like pointing out maybe ways to use them, but it's leaving a lot of room for each one of you, as from a kind of design point of view, that how do you use them, and what's your way of approaching them. And that is, I think, necessary. We maybe see that once we go to these topics in general, but that's something like that will be a quality that, in maybe good and bad, however you see it, is something that kind of colors all the blocks that we approach. So, with that being said, let me see. Oh, okay. We start with delay crashing, which is a great start. That the Affinity photo seems to be not responding. Let's see what happens in a second. But I know what's in my notes, so I can continue from there and go to the next topic, even if I cannot kind of populate on the map, which is sad for now, but maybe that kind of solves itself. Actually, let me try one thing. I'll do a quick stop sharing and see if Affinity photo wakes up. No, okay, let's just continue. So the first Lego block, which is what I call Lego block 0, is rights. So first of all, why rights? Now, to start from a practical point of view, there's an interesting quality of rights in and of themselves, that they, if you take any board game, and then you kind of shift your perspective and start to analyze it as rights. That is, let's say you are a player, it's your move, you can do certain things. If you code that into, you have a right to, say, move your piece, or you have a right to buy this and that from that and that location. And this approach can be used for essentially any board game. Of course, it contains the kind of idea of obligation, that there are some things that you must do, but that I think is included in the rights. And at some other time, we could go into the nature of right and obligation and how they kind of work together deep down. But the rights and obligations generally are connected. But for now, to continue on this example, if you would take really any board game in this manner, my experience, and I've done a lot of testing on this, I'll maybe do still the, I'll do my last try, which is like meanwhile in the background, I'll start to restart the Affinity, but let's see what happens. But I've done some analysis on trying this on several board games. And the result is I haven't yet found a board game that you couldn't analyze in this manner. Now, I could do the same actually for other games as well, like video games, certainly. And the only one that creates certain kind of softenings towards the rights is maybe role-playing games, but even they actually kind of have rights-like structures in and of themselves. That's actually an interesting question of what are soft rights, and that's a topic we'll come to in a second in the kind of subcontext of the right. But even they, I think, kind of create an analytic if you make them or put them in the forms of rights. But similarly, if you take any organization, like you are a member or you have an occupation X, you're a graphic designer. Inside an organization, corporation, whatever, like ultimately it might be in the organization software, but it's actually often beneficial if you would express those membership as rights. That is, you have a right to vote. You might have a right to make a proposal. If you make a proposal, you do it in this protocol. That protocol itself is another scope of rights that give you rights when, let's say, the protocol is about the voting and you are making a proposal. There is a certain kind of protocol of how do you make the proposal, etc. But all of these are rights. So equally as the games, if you think of organizations, rights are a Lego block in this sense, or really like a Lego block zero, like a Lego block system of analyzing both. And we come to this topic also later, but I don't think this is an accident that there is a high overlap between analytics of organizations and analytics of games. Like my ultimate argument is that they are like seeds from the same tree, you could say, but have a very different emphasis or slightly different emphasis depending on the situation. Okay, so that's the kind of starting point of why to start with rights. So the one additional topic I would say here, which I think is important as we're thinking of Lego blocks and towards the sort of more pragmatic usage questions, is that it's important to note that rights always stem from a context, a scope, a contour. We can go to the differences of these. What is the difference between scope and a contour? But the key point here is that, just like I said in the example of the voting protocol, that the voting in itself and the protocol itself is, in that case, the one that is the one giving rights. That people have coded this sort of system that says like, oh, I will distribute to all the members the possibility to click this button and then write to this field, which will become their proposal. or these several fields which kind of create the structure for the proposal, that is their right. But this has a more general point of view that, and it's actually a very important issue, is that because we can think of rights as always coming from a scope, always kind of guiding oneself of looking at, if you have a right, where does it come from, is a key analytic of both organizations and games in and of themselves. And so you can, of course, say that, okay, when I'm playing a game, it's the game that is giving the right, it's the scope. But when you're actually playing it, you can also think like, no, actually, it's that subboard or that particular voting interaction in the game, of course, games have such as well, that is currently giving me the rights. So doing these two steps is like, what is my enablement as a right? And secondly, where is it coming from? Which can have like larger scope and a smaller scope, gives you already this sort of like a tool of building branches, diagramming, etc. of how does the game work, but once again, also how does the organization work in the same language. Now, I could go to many reasons why this is, and like the interesting history of rights, like the interesting events in say pre-French Revolution, and the kind of thought around that, how rights were made or rights were reconceived or reconsidered, but maybe that's for another time. But this is the key thing here for rights, that like looking at them as an analytic towards enablement, behavior, and then similarly that they always have a context, scope, or contour. Final note on rights, and this is more behavioral, pragmatic note, which is that when people talk about rules, which is actually our next topic, but just to refer to them, there's often this sense of negative, that rules are always limiting. But then when they think of rights, they think of them often as enabling. But in a way, they stem from a very, very much the same source, which is pointing out that this is actually a much more complicated topic than saying something is limiting and something is enabling. And the positive or additive rights are the sense of, well, let's take a practical example. If you join the organization X, you suddenly gain potentially the right, which you didn't have before, of making a proposal or making a vote inside that organization. Of course, your rights might be different. You become the graphic designer, and then you get the right of, when there is a task of graphic designing, you have a right of expressing your vision, which will then be conditioned by evaluation of others, whatever it is. But those are rights you didn't have before you joined the organization. And similarly, when you go into the game, you suddenly have the right to move the pieces on the chessboard, say, and those are rights before you didn't have before you joined the chess game. So both of these are something that are pointing out to this addition that comes with the limitation. Because in order for the chess to work, you're also limited. You cannot move the pieces in this way and that way. You're subjugating you to the rules of the chess. And similarly to the organization, you cannot get these rights without subjugating yourself to the organizational nature, like behaving like in the voting as expected or not crossing the set boundaries, etc. And this is important in the sense that actually this view of saying rules are just limiting, rights are just enabling, is unanalytic and kind of problematic view. It falsifies the situation. And we should always think about them kind of pulling back and forward. Like they have both limiting and enabling conditions, and they usually create a limitation, which is the scope. Like the scope of the chess in the largest sense is the game itself and the rules. But the scope of your move is the scope of your turn and your rights there. but inside that scope, which you actually create by limiting your actions, you also are enabled by being able to do the action in itself. And of course, that's complex, this enabling and limiting, but it's I think a key factor when we come to rights and how do we think about them. So for this, I think populist language of rules and rights and populist thinking of rules and rights is actually kind of like, I think, hampering our sense of how to approach this topic. All right, so let's move to, I could actually leave some room for questions if somebody wants to comment, ask about these rights. So you have a right to make a question or a comment for now. Okay, silence reigns. I take that as no comments, questions so far. Unless there's somebody, there's some noise.
My choices are exit, voice, and loyalty. I choose loyalty.
All right. So let's move to the next topic, which is actually roles, before rules. So why to take the roles as the next one, and what do I mean by roles? Because first of all, let's start with the what do I mean by roles? So role, I take in the most general sense. It's not the acting role, it's not role as in role-playing game, but it's inherent in both and maybe more related to role in role-playing games, but it's not kind of like exhaustive in that regard. And I would put first a definition of roles, which is once again not the only definition, but a possibility I think is useful to think of, and that is roles as packages of rights. Going back to this example of you in the organization, it's often not done in that way. It's more like if you're a graphic designer, you sign a contract or something like this, but that text, which is often prose of legal nature, but it could be often written, or I think generally could be written and often would be clear if it would just list, oh, you have this right and that right and this right. And it's actually those rights in a package that can comprise your role. And then if you flip that, and to use another example, you think yourself in, say, Facebook, to pick a common example. What is your user in Facebook? It's not you. It is an interface that is a package of rights. Once again, they are starting from context, like, oh, you're now in the main page. Oh, you have the right to write here, and you have a right then to press the send button. And if you go to photos, you have a right to upload the pictures. Sorry for not knowing the exact details of Facebook, but I think it's a useful one because like most people know it, but it's more or less along those lines. So we have the sense of the user, once again, user being a role, in Facebook being a package of rights. And similarly, we could use that also for organizations. Going back to games, again, the player, often a kind of from the outside, maybe an ambiguous figure, because the player is actually kind of enablement of certain things that the player can do. And that enablement, once again, is a role having rights, which keep on changing depending on the situation of play, depending on the scope of where are you at the play, but ultimately comes to very similar language, that we can present that role of the player as a package of rights. Highly scoped, though, like like you can, like inside a game, you can buy something only in the situation when you have the 3 castles and like 5 wood and whatever the conditions are. But it's ultimately a similar thing in structure and nature. So this creates a combination between what we think of as a member, whether it's an organization, whether it's a platform in the sense of Facebook, which is ultimately an organization, or whether it's a game, from the user perspective. And I'm not saying that this is the best way to look at things in every situation. It's of course useful to bring other perspectives in, but it's a general perspective that contains an analytic and allows for this sort of looking at what is this actual position able to do, and what can happen inside this game or organization or platform in itself. Okay, that is a topic of roles as introduced. There will be kind of back references to roles and of course rights in the future, but any comments, questions on that? You have a role of a commenter or questioner that has the rights of comment and question, both of them.
I'm curious if you would frame it also in terms of agency and affordance, like the boundaries of agency and what, affordance is what do I think I can do and how do I work with that? Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think that like agency as a concept fits here. Like it's a slightly alternative, but really not that far off from this. Like you could say that, like for example, I don't think it's far off to say that your agency is can be expressed by the rights. Is like but the agency usually contains the kind of background thinking that you bring. But this is a key thing. Like when you're designing a system, you ultimately cannot address directly the background thinking, the person in itself. You can address that by holistic design that is thinking, is my system, organization, or game motivating? But you cannot be sure of that. It's more like a gestalt effect that you want from this, like, oh, people will be motivated by these moves, and this is enticing, etc. So I think it's actually very useful to make this line of like, oh, now I'm thinking of something that I can put into a system, and now I'm thinking of something that is affecting the system through the system's rules, the rights, the roles, and others coming in. And it's certainly affected by the background thinking, but that's not something in the control of the system and really not in the expression of the system itself. So for design, having that line and seeing which falls which way is actually very useful and clears up a lot of things. This is something that has been present in kind of my approaches inside EXA for a while, and when it came in, like making that line, it cleared up a lot of things. Like always thinking like, where does this fall into, and is it actually part of the system, which is not really about the person. This is to kind of illustrate this further. We can think back to the Facebook example. Facebook is also like just a set of rules. The agent is not really in the Facebook, but Facebook is constantly trying to design itself to be hooking and addicting to the agent. But that's not any rule. It's not a rule that you have to be addicted. It's more like a gestalt effect of all the rules of how Facebook works that they think and hope and generally can come to predict by testing, also maybe by design skills of how to make it addictive in itself. But that addiction in itself is outside the system, the organization, the platform, the game. And this is true, by the way, of board games as well. Like board games have learned over the years, decades, well, thousands of years, but this kind of division. And when you look at a board game design, it's always like whatever the drive is actually is just the gestalt effect, hope for the players. Any other comments, questions? Okay, let's move on. So we have now rights, the Lego block 0, the roles that can be, and I think it's useful to consider as packages of rights. They are more. and they're more especially in thinking of what's the effect to the person. But I think it's a useful starting point to think about them as packages of rights. Now we come to the rules. And of course, we have kind of been on the rules already, because one of the things about the rules is that they are one way to define a right. But rules are sort of more than that. They're also a difficult concept, because the concept in itself is, especially in our culture, very ambivalent in a way. Like I tend to have as a kind of at the outset, I tend to have make this distinction that kind of thinks of laws, rules, conventions, and tendencies as separate things. That's not a hard separation, by the way, but it's a useful separation. So laws are something that seek enforcement on a general level, to put it in a kind of soft way. And rules are really definitions of interaction. Conventions are actually something that is usually not expressed. Conventions also not define but guide interactions. But typical for conventions are that there's no written form necessarily, like this is the convention. Or if there is a written form, it leaves a lot of leeway. We tend to do this. And this is kind of encouraged kind of things. Conventions are, I think, important if we look at society, because actually most of the society runs on conventions. To take a practical example, people are said that they behave within laws, but how many of those people have actually read those laws? Like, usually almost none of them. They don't actually even know the laws, but what they are used to emulate the laws is the conventions. And this is, of course, true in many organizations, to a smaller extent, but still. And then tendencies is really like almost like often unknown behavioral pattern or behavioral drive, like that goes this way or that way. But it's the most kind of ambiguous of these. But furthermore, I would also put in the perspective that rules can be thought of as filters. And that is, whenever a rule is, it is creating this sort of way of a situation. Like, let's say you can express something inside the game. The rule is setting what kind of filter it goes through. To use board games once again as an example, because I think they're a good example here, is like in a typical board game, you have your turn. You have 3 possible moves you can do. You must choose, say, 2 of them, or 1, whatever it is. And in one of them, you can build a new house in the village. One of them, you can move a character. One of them, you can add new, like a worker in your pool. And now all of these are filters. Those are, of course, then defined and expressed as rules. So you could extend that rules are kind of definitions or expressions of filters in this sense, like, because we often face them or encounter them in the form of some kind of expression. But the key thing here for design is to look at the kind of filter-like quality. Is we create this filter, and through this filter, these kind of actions start to stream out. Like, oh, this is like they have this action of adding workers. This means that a certain amount of adding workers will happen in this game, and in the game, therefore, we will see the map populating with workers, for example. And if you then tune that, say, now the one action you can take is you can get 2 workers, it might overpopulate the map. It's too enticing, and people do that too much because it's too powerful. But that's tuning the filter, really. And I'm not saying that the filter is some kind of like a only way. And so it's certainly not the only way to think about this, but it's a useful way in and of itself to think about what you're doing when you're creating a rule. You're expressing, defining a filter. Now, the second thing, which is already said, but just to underline again, like rules establish rights. That is like, once again, this sort of enabling limiting thing. When you can do a move of adding a villager, you have a right to add a villager if you so choose from your three, which you have to choose two. But you have that right to make that choice. And then you have the right, if you choose it, to add the villager. And then you might have a right to add it into the map context to any place or a certain place or whatever it is. All of these are scopes. First scope is might make the choice. Second scope is like, now I have the right to add the villager, but then there's the map, which is the scope, and that gives you the right to place it anywhere or whatever it is. So this is important, actually, if you take a step back and look at the woods for the trees. This is addressing something that is even missing in some of the current understanding of rights, especially comes to, let's say, object capabilities, if somebody's familiar with that system, which is something that almost is like an alternative to blockchain in some ways, or of course it's a larger concept, but essentially it is a system that sets a software behaving like a rights, and the kind of operating system being a kind of kingdom where rights are really the language that are used. But an interesting thing is that Mark Miller, which is really the founding, his robust composition, the article is the founding document for object capabilities, has said that the major problem in object capabilities is that it sets up a situation where the programmer is the king, that they are the only one who can add rights, and this he sees as a major problem in object capabilities, like as something to be addressed. But now
can you share that paper, the Mark Miller paper, where he defines object capabilities?
Yeah,
there isn't like I haven't found a lot of good, clear information about object capabilities. It's like there hasn't been a lot of writing on it, but I think it's a really important thing to define and understand, especially in relationship to these kind of programmatic social and economic spaces we're trying to develop.
Sure, I can share it afterwards. I don't pick it up now, but I can share that. And but get ready for a very heavy text, over 100 pages. I can also try to dig up. There is a fairly good blog post from one of the people in the object capabilities group of kind of summarizing object capabilities, which is a useful thing to have on the side of that, because yeah, like object capabilities is a kind of a tome for this, but it is a kind of like a founding document, although also it's timed by the fact I cannot remember the exact year he wrote it, but it's I think it's his doctoral thesis, so it's also slightly dated, but it's probably the best if you want to really dig down into this. Okay, but going back to this topic, so his problem that he has defined as this sort of programmer being king, because all the ways that the system can be changed is really from the programmer point of view, is actually not limitations of right systems, and not even potentially for object capabilities if we take a different point of view. If we start from this point that every rule you set is actually a generator of rights, and then if you look at actually the normal organizations from this point of view that we are kind of building here. So if we stick for a while this sort of normal organization and the earlier examples, every one of them actually creates new rights. That is, if I set up a cooperative and I invite people there, what I give people, if I invite them as members, is rights into that scope of organization. And that means that in that scope, towards that organization, those rights are born, stemming from that organization itself. And of course, this can be created also with programming. It just needs a little bit of a different, not a kind of top-down approach to the system, but rather a highly distributed system where when you start an organization in itself, it's really tailored to this understanding that, okay, these are actually all generators to rights to their scope. All of those scopes, by the way, can expand by the fact of the inviting more people, and therefore those rights becoming more and more influential by the fact that they start to touch upon other people. So, so this, of course, now that we're in rules, relates to rules as rules being ways to define what the right is and creating the filter of the right, just like the earlier example of you can make the move of adding the villagers. But underneath there, to see this possibility that it is really generating something of a new enablement in society. Yes, in a very limited scope, inside a game, inside an organization. It's the same thing again, but it is a new enablement that was not possible before. And it is an expansion to a person who is a member and to their rights, which I think is ultimately very important in this mindset that actually, if we think about social questions and extending society, etc., this is pointing out how a distributed factor of extending society can happen. And every scope you create becomes a scope of rights, and even though it's limited, the more people you can invite into it, more people you can kind of organize or organize between organizations. That becomes the way to expand into the further society. No one of us, including the nations, really has a general control of anything and cannot set any right to be universal in this planet. But in this manner, all of the scopes can find a way to offer how they could expand themselves. And this combination of rules as expressions and them being kind of the filters that then become the point of defining what the right is a key factor. And it, of course, once again happens in every damn board game or really any other game underneath, often or usually not expressed as rights. But it's also something that happens even pragmatically inside organizations, but it's often not thought of in that manner. So, but yeah, the key thing here is like to create this perspective where, you know, the Lego blockiness reveals itself of this, and how when we come from the rights, we look at the roles and we look at the rules as kind of expression, and also being aware of their possibilities and their awareness of that what we are creating with them. We still have an analytic in this. Final point on rules. Of course, there would be many points more on this or any of these topics, but introduction is an introduction. So the final point, rules also have this capability of being both soft and hard, and even metaphoric. Because rules are usually expressed. You can make a rule, let's say of a hard rule, say in football or soccer, is that when a ball passes, and if there are no other objecting rules like breaking some other rule, when a ball passes the goalposts, one goal is marked to the board. That is a relatively hard rule in itself. But you could create a game that is that every player who plays them in the most stylistic manner gets points, and then there is a voting on that. Well, the voting is sort of hard, but actually because it's actually opening up the space to people to evaluate what the rule is, or evaluate what is the effect of it. Then you have the sense of the softness of the rule, because what is the most stylistic elegant is not set. And they can even be metaphoric. You could set a football game where people like you have a rule that people should play in a springly fashion, or in the color of spring, or whatever that is, and that still works. This is actually used in things like game poems and etc. Cultures like this have kind of honed in on this sort of metaphoric quality of rules. And this is because it comes from expression, and expression is something that guides them, and therefore they bring in everything that we consider inside expressions themselves. Okay, so that's rules for now as an introduction. Any questions, comments on that?
That was great. Thank you for sharing that. Really, really interesting.
Thanks for that comment. I think the key thing there is always think that when you're creating a rule, you're expressing, just like you were writing a book or sentences to something, because it is actually something that is often kind of thought of from the rules, but their expressivity is more telling, because then one can maybe be aware of all this expressive range which they carry almost even if you don't want it or not. Like, because we often struggle, we want to make the rules hard, but because they're expressions, the softness comes in, because that's the nature of expressions in and of themselves. But that is also a strength sometimes, because that's maybe for another time, but there are some really interesting examples of using soft rules. And of course, like creating softness of, hey, let's evaluate what is the more stylistic player, and then creating a protocol where people can give points is a way to make people think about what is stylistic. People who would watch that game and they have the right of giving points, they will behave differently. So these kind of qualities are actually ways to expand what the game is, and also what the organization is in the similar manner, because once again, the structures are the same. Okay, so a kind of combining point, this will be a shorter one, but I'll point out that there is an interesting perspective you can take almost in any situation. That is, wherever you are, you can, and I'll do that actually one after. I'll introduce one more point, which is goals. And goals actually also have subtopic of a question. And the reason why goals and questions are grouped together is that they actually behave similarly. That is, a goal as a structure is a way to define towards the future. It's the future of the game. You're in the start of the game. You create the goal. Perhaps you solidify that goal by putting an award on it. But that's a way of creating tendencies of behavior. Like, oh, it of course can be a hard condition, like this is how you win. But it can also be you win by having the most points, but if you go here and you bring one worker here, you get 2 points. Both are ways of giving awards, but they are also solidifying something that is a goal structure. And this connection between goal as defining future towards the behavior in itself is, of course, a key design possibility. The game or the organization not just being a state of things as they are, but actually kind of setting something that is not just a cloud, but more defined thing towards where does it go, is a possibility of goals. But why did I put questions here in the same category? Now, this is actually has been revealed by some of the newer game designs on the kind of role-playing games and story games side, is that they have been more and more extensively utilizing question structures for the same thing, for defining future or kind of creating a tendency, especially. That is, when you set the question, that question is something that it might be very short-term future, that, oh, this is something that guides people. Now I have to find an answer to this question. But of course, it also works that, like, let's say your company has charter, but you write that charter only in the form of questions. Like, how do you find the best way to do X, Y, and Z? Those questions work also as definitions. They are not hard corridors, but still corridors, the sense of what orients things. but they also define this sort of future like quality. And in this sense, questions are also expressions that can be used in the way of the goals as well. So they function in the same field. But I think the key contribution of both is this future and the possibility of putting that future as something that guides the structure that you created, whether it's an organization or a game, like putting a kind of directionality to it. And then when you combine that with this sort of possibility of solidifying and awards in the widest sense, which is also like, if you take an example of where we have this project, and if this project comes completed, these and these people get this and this many tokens. Well, that's the same thing. It's a goal with solidifying by the tokens themselves. And even if that's normal practice, it's really the same structure again. So that, once again, a short introduction, but what I'm trying to do with that is to give a kind of where does the goal slot in this sort of design analytic that we're building here.
Pekka, so you've been iterating through a list of terms. I've been writing them down. It would be really great, actually, if you just created like a very like cursory glossary of these terms that you're using and these definitions with like one or two just sentences. Because like I think like you mean very specific things when you say what is a player, what are rules, what are conventions, what is organizational scope, what are goals, and then like you can actually sort of create just like just a list. That would be really helpful.
Yeah, actually, that was the aim before Affinity crashed and decided to lock down completely and not show itself on the screen, which like I had that list and I have it still, but like apparently, which was sort of a surprise that it seems to not like Zoom properly. It doesn't seem to like Zoom screen sharing. So I'm kind of improvising without the list, but we can also
just for next time, just like a doc, a Google Doc or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but that's that's something, probably something that I don't know if it helps me. Oh, a different program. I'll have to look at it at some point. But yeah. So, but yeah, that's kind of like what I had for this. And yeah,
it'd be helpful for next time.
Yeah.
I need to balance in a minute, but I just wanted to throw that out there. But this was good and very like I think focused, which is great.
So let me put. I'll make a quick summary of the last remaining things. I can put them in, say, inside 5 minutes, and then you have a sort of a mapping from that. So as the next point, I'll jump over one interesting example, but we'll keep this short. The next point is tokens, and tokens I would characterize as distributive operations. And what I mean by that is like really the point of tokens is the distribution itself. Like the point, for example, if you put tokens in and then you put a rule that going through this door or giving access to this, you have to utilize a token in itself. What you have created by the tokens is the possibility that rather than having like just the core, there are pieces of the organization, which the tokens are. They belong to an organization. They also might develop relations to other organizations like exchanges, etc. But nevertheless, like even those exchanges are organizations in themselves. But the possibility of like transferring by themselves introduces a very like a truly distributive nature of the condition. But also for this, there is a counterpart in games, and that is points. And especially if you look at board games and how they use points, like, oh, to build this, you need 3 wood and 5 iron, whatever it is. Those are actually like tokens. in structural sense. Like, oh, my way of getting one iron is going there, and then I get this one, well, a token that I put on my stash, and then when I collect there, I can think about my actions by paying for that thing with these various tokens, with even different token types, etc. And this is not an accident that these things are reflected. Of course, what's interesting is that points in games have much more variety in structural terms than tokens in, say, crypto. Although, like, there's some structures in crypto that you don't see in games, there's a whole variety of structures that you don't see in crypto that are in different board games. And to keep this short, I'll stop that for now. But there would be a lot to talk about why distributed structures, especially when your organization functions in the real world, are useful. And of course, that's probably one of the reasons for the importance of the token. But finally, like, if you remove an organization, say a stock, which is a kind of a token in itself, if you remove all the organizations that provide the interactions, like I can exchange this stock to money or something, there's nothing in those tokens, really. Like, and this puts, like, tokens are almost like button to the machine of organization or organizations in itself. Without the machine, the button does nothing. But when you interact, you often interact through the buttons. And I do think, even that's a metaphor, it's a very useful way of thinking of tokens as design element. Okay, final structural point. There's a couple of other points, but for Eric, if you have to leave, this is the final structural point. And this is networks, maps, boards, and diagrams. And what I mean by this is that every organization is a network. Every game is a network as well, in the widest sense. It is a system of correlating rules, other correlating elements, etc., that certainly fits to the definition of a network. But why did I have the other terms, the maps, the boards, the diagrams? Networks by themselves are actually hard interfaces for humans. And we often build, or we really have to build representations for those networks. So yes, Facebook is a network, but it's also an interface, which is you could think of it in a diagrammatic way, you can think of it as a map, you can think of it also as a board, like a board game. But that in itself provides you access, yes, an interface towards how the network is operated in itself. Sometimes these two can be close, the network and the representation, like in the case of a board game, but it's still a good division to make, because if you have an organization, you could make that same system of the organization to be represented this way or that way. You could even create an alternative representation of the organization, like how to play the organization itself. Like, let's make this into a board. And those actually might even be just as valid. There might be, in some cases, just representations, but they might be operational. Like, actions done there might be accepted in the organization. And this puts this sort of possibility of multitude of presences for these networks, which comes from the limitations that the networks themselves don't really have a face. Because a network is not in the nature of having one face. But because of this, we have to give it a face. And that face is an interface. But it's also like a bigger structural question of what kind of a face. And the face affects the interactions in itself. And therefore, I put together this question of networks. Maybe one can call it from networks to maps, and from networks to the mappings, as a kind of thought about it, and a way to think about it in a kind of design analytic. Okay, I have a couple of like approach points from this, but
why don't we save them for? We should save it then for next time.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of the same and kind of leaving it there. But just to kind of put the list as a summary. The right was the Lego Zero. And then we have the roles as packages of rights, which is really also access points for agents, the agents being outside of the system. We have the rules, which are filters and definitions of filters or expressions of filters, but contain the expressionality. We have the goals, which are definitions towards the future. Of course, they can be, these overlap. They are kind of rules if they're set in, but they are precisely kind of aimed towards the future in itself, and questions are a kind of alternative way of approaching them. And then we have the tokens, which are ways to kind of send out, to distribute operations. But the operations are ultimately referring back to this sort of organizations, games in and of themselves. Really, it's similar to a board game and its tokens, which also mean nothing outside the board game. And then we have the networks and maps, this sort of from networks to maps, that everything we create ultimately, if it's a system, it's a network. But it has to have a phase, and that phase is not one true phase. Maybe there's only one phase existing, but other phases could be created. And that introduces this also possibility, not just the limitation of mapping and the creativity of mapping, and how that interface in itself affects the action. That's the list for now.
Cool. All right, I do need to jump. Awesome. I'll talk to you next week. Nice to meet you, Pablo.
Nice to meet you.
See you guys later.
Yes, see you. Thanks for
See you,
coming.
Eric.
Maybe for next session we could, or I would be interested in knowing more about your views on enforcing rules, how rules are enforced, like sort of like the boundaries between when it's a soft rule, when it's a hard rule. You were talking about soccer, you know, like the rules, you should not touch the ball with your hand, right? But of course that has happened, and even there's historic goals that are celebrated because of the fact that the rule was broken. So I'm just curious of enforcement of rules. Maybe we can talk about it next session.
Oh, yeah, we could talk about it because I have a lot to say on it. And I even think I have a solution. Okay. And why obligation is not an obligation for systems. But it would be actually a very interesting topic because like for example, that's touched upon by rewards, but rewards are enticements. They're not strict obligations. But also like maybe the one condensation, like I said, the rest of this topic can be left for later, but one condensated version is like when you're designing a system like an organization or a game, the sayings you must do this, especially if you go to organizations, is not necessarily the most effective way of doing things. Rather, because the system cannot understand the must because it goes to the agent side. Like it can say to a person, you must return this in 2 weeks, but the person might not return. So that's not your design element. But you, of course, you can design towards that by creating these enticements or whatnot. But there's another way, which is that, and what the system can address is like, what happens? Like if this document does not appear in 2 weeks, what happens? And so in this sense, like the possibility of designing is not in the must, but it's rather what happens if the condition is not met. And that is something you can design and something that can exist in the system. Like, for example, if it doesn't appear in 2 weeks, then 50 tokens are removed from the pool is in the system language. Whereas like you went over and we were just relying on you having to do this is just this sort of extraordinary situation of negotiations, which of course you might want, and negotiations are fine here. And that's another topic actually we could address, like how to build this sort of, how actually these kind of rules are not limiting out negotiations, free interactions. They actually can even enable it, but that's for another day. But here the possibility of designing is not the strength of the obligation, but it's rather the what are the conditions of measuring a change in the state, like, for example, diminishing tokens or diminishing rights or whatever it is. And that's actually what you can address, rather than whether the person actually has a mental breakdown or is tired or whatever the condition is. So that's the short answer, but let's put it in the list of next week, including this negotiation and kind of like freer interactions, which, like I said, are actually not limited here at all. Like it's also another false myth, but I can talk about that later.
Perfect.
Any other questions, comments, Felix?
No, I think I liked the session, and I liked sticking to these few basic elements, and I think I would be I think it would be good to have it also in a doc to just recapitulate before next session.
Sure.
I don't have any further question. I mean, I'm interested in this, in the difference between predetermined sanctions and sanctions that are up for deliberation between a group, so kind of ad hoc sanctions.
Yeah.
So that would point towards conflict resolution mechanisms that some groups are already experimenting with.
Yeah, I think it's an important topic, and also, like, I think actually these kind of analytics offer a lot of approaches with this just pre-mentioned kind of perspective towards it. I would put that let's call it kind of like from obligations to conditions or whatever one calls it, but essentially what you've both been saying. I would put the kind of negotiation and kind of freedom of interaction as another topic, because, like I said, I think it's important to see how this actually leaves a lot of room for it, but we didn't get to that there. And finally, I would put the topic of examples and how this analytic can be put to work, and what kind of approaches it creates. It's a very much a design philosophy analytic. Like I said, it's still expecting that you learn from it and use it, and of course there's more to this. This was just an introduction, but still, like, I think it starts from this point that it's still kind of, it expects you to use this as tools for your skills, and but your skills still as a designer still apply. But yeah, let's take those three topics, the kind of from obligation to condition to the kind of freedom of interaction to examples, and the analytic in use for next week. If other topics, of course, might be added later or proposed if you want something else.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, any final comments? And I can stay for a while to discuss. Yeah, like, too bad really the document didn't work, because like I could have not only shown the text but drawn at the same time. But yeah, I didn't try Zoom on recording and the affinity at the same time, and I think that killed it, which is unfortunate. But yeah, like it would have certainly helped you to see what these topics are. But next time maybe I figure out something.
Sure. Just wanted to say, exciting to be here, and yeah, I'll see you around.
Yeah, likewise. And you're generally welcome to the group. It's meant to be inclusive, so consider you part of it as much as you want.
Thank you.
All right, guys. See you next week then. I have
Yeah.
to head off as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for the call.
Thanks. I'll stop the recording.